Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Courtney Ray,
I am Dr. Will McBride.
and we were selected as the delegate representatives of SBN for the Minnesota Update Conference that took place in summer of 2022. So we are here today to give you an update on that conference and also to give you information about what happens now. Um, just as a little background for what the conference was about, how it came to fruition, and what the purposes of it were, we want to just share with you a little bit of history. So, the Relevance 2050 initiative of AACN wanted to seek involvement of those beyond AACN membership to figure out what are some things that need to be incorporated into the guidelines for what neuropsychology is. And in 2020, the Houston Conference Call to Action Subcommittee was not called to lead it, but to have a call for an interorganizational committee to review the Houston Conference guidelines because they hadn't been reviewed for 30 years. And the idea was never to start from scratch, but using the Houston Conference guidelines as a foundation to update them. So this initially was called the Houston Conference Update Conference, but then once we got it to Minnesota, and that was the designated place, it became known as the Minnesota guidelines, and you'll hear us refer to that as such throughout this presentation. And so the idea was to make sure that we incorporate and articulate all the different competencies and approaches to training that were specific to neuropsychology and do something that previous guidelines had not done, and that is to have a focus on multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multicultural issues in every part of the training experience, and to also make sure that there was an emphasis on technology as well, because moving into the 21st century, we know that technology is an important part of not only our field, but of society in general. And so the idea was getting all these different people together from various organizations to make sure that each person could have their voices heard and allow individuals to talk about what now is relevant in neuropsychology and help to set new standards for training programs. So, as I said, it was desired to get the buy-in from several organizations, and you see them here displayed on the screen. SBN was obviously one of those Planning Commission members organizationally, and Dr. Natalie Kelly and myself were part of the SBN delegation to be a part of this planning committee. There were also other members of SBN who were part of the planning commission as well, but they were not necessarily representatives of SBN. They were representing their other organizations. Additionally, SBN was a fiscal sponsor of the conference as well, because we wanted to make sure that we contributed to the success of it financially. So at the end of the planning, one of the things that was determined was that we wanted to make sure that there was broad representation of the delegations, so that each organization could have a voice. So each organization nominated 3 to 5 delegates, and SBN nominated 5 people. 2 people were selected by the delegate committee of the Planning Commission. In total, there were 79 completed nominations. And then in addition to that, in case someone was nominated by their organization but they were not selected, or there were people who were just not connected to an organization necessarily but still wanted to be a part of this historic conference, they were invited to give a delegate at large nomination and self-nominate. And there were 153 people who completed the at-large applications as well, because this wasn't just about the organizations, but we wanted to get the voices of everyone who's involved. And here you can see the MNC delegates, and there obviously was a wide array of people from various backgrounds. We also wanted to make sure that it wasn't just diverse ethnically, culturally, and racially, but also by gender, by disability status, by education level. So we have trainees and we have people all the way up to retirees. We have early, middle, and late career. We wanted to make sure that there was adequate representation for different geographical locations. So we even had international people who came as observers, in addition to people all over the nation. There were a variety of people in different fields. So there were some lifespans, some people who were academics, some people who were in clinical private practice, just really making sure that it was a diverse population. It wasn't dominated just by geriatric, but we also had pediatric and other people representing the different aspects of neuropsych. Will McBride and myself were the SBN delegates, but there were also, again, a large number of SBN representation, even if they were not the official delegates from SBN. SBN was also involved as being a part of different structural teams during the conference. So some of us were team leaders. There were SBN representation on the steering committee and also on the content panel as well. Now that the conference is over, we have been asked to deliver to you the policy documents and to get feedback from the constituents. So we, the delegates, want to hear from you. Eventually, these policy documents will be publicized in TCN and also in the archives of clinical neuropsychology, and also distributed to different programs and adopted, hopefully, by various graduate programs in neuropsych.
Like Dr. Ray was saying, now is the time to kind of move forward with a lot of the actions that the guidelines conference has started, so that we can keep things moving forward. And so I'll be talking a little bit about some of the nuts and bolts of things that went on at the conference. Here is a broad overview. And again, a lot of this will be going when you go through and actually read the guidelines, will give more clarity. But overall, changes from Houston Conference Guidelines to the Minnesota Conference Guidelines, the overarching framework provided by the Houston Conference is unchanged, meaning that training still occurs at all levels and entry-level practice begins after a formal 2-year postdoc. The policy statement, now updated, will be very detailed compared to Houston Conference, which was an issue with the Houston Conference Guidelines, in that there wasn't necessarily the level of clarity on how to carry out some of the things. It was more aspiration, so to speak, in terms of the guidelines and the framework. But like Dr. Ray was saying, the narrative for this new update is going to be centered around equity, justice, and inclusion. And also there are going to be contemporary competencies and elements that foundational competencies that are central to what neuropsychologists do. How do we practice? What are the things that are central to the work that we do? Votes at the conference were based on drafted language, understanding that the final version of this would be wordsmith, meaning that it will be refined to make language more concise after the conference. In terms of voting process, it was very formalized. Robert's Rules of Engagement, if you're familiar with that, approval of overarching foundational and functional competencies was held. So we voted on what are functional competencies, what are foundational competencies, which are laid out in the guidelines. All of that was voted on. Approval of the draft narrative related to how do we define EJI and how do we center that within the policy statement, with a reference to acknowledging the harms, the historical context of how the neuropsychology as a field has perpetuated or impacted marginalized groups. Approval of a request that the Clinical Neuropsychology Special Counsel take up an apology statement was put forth, similar to what APA's 2021 apology to people of color for APA's role in promoting racism and discrimination. So neuropsychology is taking steps to acknowledge its role in those aspects. Implementation and dissemination were not finalized at the conference as well. So those were some things. So things that still need to be worked on, implementation and dissemination. How do we disseminate? How do universities, internships, how do these things get carried out? In terms of approved competencies, the foundational competencies include integration of science and practice, ethics, standards, law, and policies, equity, justice, cultural respect, and inclusion, self-reflection and self-care, interpersonal skills, very similar to what, the competencies that we as clinical psychologists have to have. The functional competencies include assessment, intervention and resource knowledge, interdisciplinary systems and consultation, research and scholarly activities, teaching, supervision, and mentoring, management and administration, advocacy, and technology and innovation. Again, this is in line with changes in things looking forward and ahead in terms of how advocacy needs to be such a role for all psychologists, but especially for neuropsychologists, and the inclusion of, how do you use technology and innovation within your role as a neuropsychologist. When you all get a chance to look through the Minnesota Guidelines policy document, it's going to be broken down into headings. We have the preamble, the definitions and scope of the document, and then the guidelines themselves. So a list of 13 foundational and functional competencies, the elements that define each competency, and then tables with expanded competency definitions. And then at the end, of course, you always got to have your references. So this is the layout of the document that will be disseminated to the SBN membership. So what do we need from SBN constituents? So the first thing is to make sure that your membership is in good standing. As an organization, we want to have feedback from all of our members. We need our members to be in good standing. Watch this video, right? And so please watch this video before any next steps so that you can have some context and some background of what's going on and what I need to do, because we really want SBN members to have time to reflect on this thoughtfully. This is the significance of this is great, right? We're updating these Houston Conference guidelines that I reference a lot. And so something that we need to do. Read the Minnesota Conference guidelines. So find some time to read those. Attend the virtual SBN town hall. It's scheduled for May 31st. And then at that town hall, we'll go through and answer questions related to any aspects or issue related to the conference guidelines. Okay. We won't necessarily be focused on like, hey, why was this all done? All of that historical context we tried to explain in this video, so that way we can focus more on the work that needs to be done. And that's for the SBN members to be able to ask questions about any concerns related to what is in the document, what's missing, and then also provide feedback virtually. The task there will be completing the Minnesota Conference Guideline feedback survey, which we will disseminate. And that deadline is June 8th at 11:59 p.m. So that gives constituents weeks to complete the feedback of the survey, so that then we can go do our task. So after the town hall, Dr. Ray and I, with the help of a delegate committee or task force, we will review survey feedback. So we will try to organize and synthesize the survey feedback with a 2-week turnaround. And then we will try to identify amendments SBN constituents may or may not desire. Okay, so the survey results will be made available to the SBN membership. So we want there to be transparency in that, hey, this is the response rate that we have. This is what seems to be a general theme of concerns, or, hey, we like the document, we don't. These are things that are good, what have you. And Dr. Ray and I will complete the training guidelines amendment form if necessary. So if there are proposed amendments or things that the SBN body sees as like, hey, this is something that needs to be changed, we will complete that amendment form and send those proposed amendments to the Minnesota Conference Guidelines Committee. And then it's a waiting game. So one of the things, like Dr. Ray might have mentioned, is that all of the organizations that were involved that submitted delegates and had delegates present, they are doing this with all of their constituents, with all of their members of their organizations. And so there are going to be multiple organizations potentially submitting amendments and things of that nature. So this is going to be a process that is going to take some time, and change is slow, always has been. But it's one of those things where we want to be able to get the information out to you all and be able to submit that and move it forward. If there are any questions after watching this video, please email the soblackneuro@gmail.com email address. And in the subject line, please put MNC guidelines. So that way those emails can be forwarded to us and it makes it easier for us to track what feedback or questions that you may have. We thank you all for taking the time to watch this video. We are looking forward to having this town hall and moving things forward. This is a very exciting time. And so we greatly appreciate your time and being a member of SBN.